The Big Five Cannabis. Our week-long series continues with more of what you need to know about legal pot in Canada, the rules, the responsibilities, and the unanswered questions. Tonight, we'll focus on how legal cannabis in Canada could affect travel to the United States. The House begins debate on the proposed legislation to end solitary confinement in federal prisons. We'll take a closer look at the proposal and reaction to it. And the federal government proposes tougher rules on bestiality and animal cruelty. But do the changes go far enough? We begin tonight with part 4 of our week-long series, The Big Five Cannabis. Each day this week, we are looking at some of the outstanding issues and questions around legalization now that the almost century-old prohibition on pot has come to an end. But with legalization has come a patchwork of regulations and restrictions from province to province. And tonight we'll look at Canada and the border. We'll hear from Bill Blair, Canada's Minister of Border Security and Organized Crime Reduction. We'll also speak with immigration attorneys who are concerned about the way the federal government has handled this issue and have their own advice for Canadians at the border. And we'll also hear from the state of Colorado's former Director of Marijuana Coordination to learn more about that state's experience with legalized cannabis. But first, here's what you need to know about cannabis and the border. Nearly 400,000 people cross the Canada-US border every day. For weeks, signs have been popping up along the border warning Canadians not to bring any cannabis into the US. Cannabis is legal in 9 states, but federal law applies when entering the US, and according to that law, cannabis remains illegal. For weeks, there were concerns that Canadians involved in the legal cannabis industry in this country would be turned away by U.S. officials or even banned for life from entering the U.S. But the U.S. softened its position last week. It now says Canadians involved in the legal cannabis industry traveling to the U.S. for reasons unrelated to the cannabis industry will generally be allowed in. But that doesn't mean all Canadians are in the clear. Travelers who admit to past use of cannabis could be turned away by U.S. officials. And U.S. officials reiterated this week that border agents have broad discretion to question travelers and decide who should be let in. U.S. officials also said the U.S. does not recognize foreign pardons, so even Canadians who receive a pardon for a past cannabis conviction could be denied entry by U.S. officials. For our special series this week on cannabis legalization, I sat down for an extended discussion with the federal government's point person on cannabis, Bill Blair. He's Canada's Minister of Border Security and Organized Crime Reduction. This week we covered unanswered questions on the law, the business of cannabis, the rules, and health issues. Tonight, our conversation focuses on cannabis and the border. Bill Blair, thanks for all the time you're giving us this week for this series. Our conversation continues. Let's talk about the border. We know the Canadian border officials will be asking everyone entering Canada if they are carrying cannabis products, but what about Canadians entering the United States? What should they know about traveling to the U.S. now that pot's legal in Canada?
They should know that it will be against the law, a serious federal offense, to carry cannabis in any amount, even as much as a seed, from Canada into the U.S. or from the U.S. into Canada. I do not want any Canadian to be confused. And in fact, at every border point, we have now put up signs. We've sent a mailer out to every Canadian household. We want to make sure that Canadians know the law and don't inadvertently get themselves into difficulty, because although it may be legal for an adult to possess licensed and licensed produced and distributed cannabis in Canada, they cannot, under any circumstance, take it into the United States.
The U.S. has backed off or clarified what some saw as an initial threat to ban anyone working in, or the possibility of banning anyone who worked in the legal cannabis industry in Canada from entering the U.S. For life. Now that won't be the case as long as they're entering the United States for leisure. But what about there are some states in the U.S. that have legalized recreational cannabis too. Let's say Colorado, for instance. Mm-hmm. What if somebody who works in the industry in Canada is on their way to Colorado to work in the industry or to consult with industry players there? That could still be a big problem. Are you okay with that?
Well, and in fact, first of all, the United States is a sovereign country and has the ability to set its own laws and its own rules with respect to entry. There it remains a federal offense. After Wednesday, it'll be legalized. That business activity will be legal in Canada, but not in the United States. And if you're going to the United States saying, coming into your country with the intention of engaging a business which in your country is illegal, they're very likely going to have a lot of questions and could potentially exclude somebody from entering. And so, I think their clarification has been really helpful, because a lot of people were I think, unnecessarily anxious and concerned, because the suggestion was if you had a mutual fund investment that held a cannabis company in its holdings, that you were somehow in jeopardy. The Americans have been very, very good in clarifying that, and what they've said that generally, if you're engaged in the business legally in Canada, generally that will not be an impediment to coming into the country. But if you're coming in to engage in the cannabis business in the United States, for the federal government in the U.S., the cannabis business remains illegal, and so
does that make sense? Does that make sense to you? So you've got a legal cannabis businessman in Canada, businesswoman in Canada, heading to Colorado to talk to another legal cannabis businesswoman in Colorado. Should they admit that at the border, that that's what they're doing? What should they say?
Well, first of all, it's an offense to lie to border agents, and I never suggest, I'm an old law enforcement person myself, but I would never suggest that anyone lie to a border agent. But one of the things that Canadians also have to recognize is that they have a choice. If you present yourself at the border and you're asked a question you do not wish to answer, do not lie, but you don't have to incriminate yourself either. You have a choice. You can turn around and head back into Canada.
If you do that, do you expect them to flag your name? So that, we heard this said, come back another day, or come back, try another agent another time. Wouldn't you expect that? So if Bill Blair shows up at the border and doesn't want to answer questions, there's a little flag beside Bill Blair's name. Next time he comes to his border crossing, is he flagged? What
I expect is that the Americans, like Canada, they have a responsibility to ensure the safety and security and the upholding of the laws of their country. It's exactly as we do. And so I also learned from the experience. We've had a licensed cannabis industry in this country for 5 years. In a place to thousands of Canadians. We also have about 4.5 million Canadians who admit that at some point in time they've used cannabis. This has not been a significant impediment to them coming and crossing the border. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians do it every single day. The U.S. has indicated to us business as usual, and that's my expectation. But Canadians, again, have to be aware that it is against the law and they've got to be careful with this, to carry cannabis into the U.S. or to engage in the cannabis business in the United States. That's against U.S. law.
We know that half the population of this country has consumed illegal cannabis over the years. So, I mean, is it your intention to continue a dialogue with the Americans to say, look, you really have to be clear to Canadian? What is the expectation of a Canadian who says, I smoked a joint 35 years ago? If they get the wrong border guard on the wrong day, they can go, you're not coming into the U.S. today, and you're not ever coming in.
Frankly, if you get the wrong guy on the wrong day, you can be excluded for a myriad of reasons, including that one. I think the experience that Canadians have had, and as you've said, Peter, almost half of all Canadians have at some point used this drug, but they don't get asked that. If you present yourself at the border smelling of marijuana or making statements about your intention either to consume marijuana
looking like
or to be in the business,
Cheech and Chong, as you
I have used that phrase. If you present yourself looking like Cheech and Chong, that iconic
they get treated
thing,
like Cheech and Chong.
Absolutely, and so it's a serious bit of business to seek entry into a foreign country. And in the United States, they're our greatest trading partner and closest ally. But when you're coming into their country, you're going to have to obey their rules.
Let's finish on this. Do you think Canada is going to become a tourism haven for cannabis tourism?
Well, it hasn't necessarily been the experience. There are now 9 U.S. states that have legalized cannabis, and I think the novelty of in the first couple of years that was the case. Frankly, I still expect anybody in Canada who chooses to use cannabis do it in a socially responsible way and a healthful way. And again, we're not trying to normalize the use of this. We're just trying to give adults who are making this choice healthier choices, lower risk choices. And the regulations that are being put in place in municipalities right across the country are done in order to support a socially responsible approach to this thing, much as we have done with tobacco.
All right, Bill Blair, thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, the federal government says it expects largely business as usual at the Canada-U.S. border now that cannabis is legal. But Bill Blair also says Canadians should know the rules and be careful if they plan to travel to the United States. And what happens if they get questioned by a U.S. border official? Is there more the government should be doing to defend Canadian travelers? And what questions still remain when it comes to crossing into the United States? Let's talk about that. From Vancouver, I'm joined by Len Saunders, a Canadian-born U.S. immigration attorney based in Blaine, Washington. He has worked with dozens dozens of Canadians who've been denied entry to the U.S. because of cannabis-related issues. And here with me in Ottawa is Warren Creets, a certified specialist in immigration law. Thanks to both of you for doing this. And Warren, I should point out before we get started that your law firm is actually teaching the first and only law course in cannabis in the country at the University of Ottawa here.
That's right, at the law school
here
in Ottawa. Well, it's very interesting and innovative. We start the program in January, and 25 students filled up. That's the limit on the registration. There's a waiting list of 90 others who wanted to get into it.
And so we might see more of that in this country with legalization. We'll get to more of all the issues involved with Warren in a second. But Len Saunders, let me bring you in here. Your law office is just, we know, 2 blocks south of the Canada-U.S. border. Give us a sense of what Canadian travelers should expect when crossing into the U.S. now that pot's legal on this side of the border.
I'm telling Canadians, until there's more guidelines or a firmer answer from the Americans, to be careful entering the United States. It's dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting some different, we're getting a bit of indications from the Americans, Warren, that they've softened their position when it comes to Canadians who work in the legal cannabis industry. They're now saying a Canadian citizen working in or facilitating the proliferation of the legal marijuana industry in Canada coming to the U.S. for reasons unrelated to the marijuana industry generally will be admissible to the U.S. What do you make of that? Is that the problem solved for people who work in the industry traveling to the U.S.?
Totally not good enough, I don't think. They want our money. Wall Street has poured billions of dollars into our industry in Canada, taken very significant equity positions in some of our publicly listed companies included. They want our money, but they're going to deny entry to our executives, investors, and others that are seeking entry to the United States for anything related to the marijuana industry.
Right. I guess that's the question. What Len Saunders, what they're saying here is that if you're coming to the United States for leisure, you'll be fine, or generally you'll be fine. But what if a Canadian working in the legal marijuana industry, cannabis industry in this country, wants to travel to Colorado, where it's also legal, to attend a conference on marijuana or cannabis there? Should that person say that's where they're headed?
Well, if they do, they will be denied entry. That's my experience. So I'm telling Canadians, be cautious what you're coming to the U.S. to do and what you say, because you could be denied entry if you have any kind of involvement in the U.S. cannabis industry.
So what do you do?
Well, you either don't tell them what you're going down to do, and if they find out, they could bar you for life. If you tell them, then there's a good chance they're going to deny you entry. So it's kind of a catch-22. It's hard to advise people on what to say, because I don't want to get them barred for lying at the border and encouraging them to lie. But at the same time, if they tell the truth, they're probably going to get denied entry. So it puts everyone in a very difficult position.
Warren, what do you think of the advice the Canadian government's been giving Canadian travelers, saying, look, whatever you do, don't lie. You get to the border, if you're asked the question, are you going to the U.S. to either attend a marijuana or to work in somehow in the marijuana field, or if you're just a Canadian traveler going on holidays, should you admit that you have smoked marijuana in the past if you're asked?
The public statements from our elected officials so far has been just tell the truth, answer their questions. The Americans make their own rules on entry. I don't think that's good enough. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry. I don't think we've seen the valuations in any industry like we're now seeing in a very long time. Mining industry, energy, just compare them. Mm-hmm. These are incredible. So I think it's incumbent upon our elected officials and the the cross-border discussions that take place to advocate on behalf of our industry, to advocate on behalf of our people, so that they can gain entry or granted entry to the United States. It's not enough to just say it's up to the individual, let them do and follow the rules and that kind of stuff. They have to follow the rules, but our leaders should be lobbying, promoting, advocating on behalf of our industry.
How do they do that? As Bill Blair says, the U.S. is a sovereign country. They have their rules, and it's not like we're in a position to tell them how to apply their rules to Canadians. But you're saying maybe we should be.
Well, we should be. And this is divisive. Not all congressmen in the United States are in agreement on the U.S. Customs and Border Protection's position on this. They are lobbying their own people in Congress to grant entry to our people. This is a big deal. This is a big, not just just a big deal. It's a huge opportunity for the lawful states that have approved recreational and medical use of marijuana as well.
Len Saunders, what do you think? Is there more Canada could be doing to help make this issue, to provide more clarity for Canadian travelers?
Absolutely. I agree with Warren 100%. The Canadian government has done a very poor job in basically advising Canadians on the lifetime implications of any kind of admissions to marijuana use or involvement at U.S. ports of entry. So they've been giving the worst advice, which is telling people to tell the truth. That's self-incrimination. They should be advising Canadians what their rights are at the border. And, you know, I don't know at what point the Canadian government is going to wake up and realize that this is an issue.
Okay, but if you decide, one of the pieces of advice is that the government gives is that you're always free to abandon your attempt to enter the U.S. because they're asking you about cannabis usage and you don't want to answer the question. Doesn't that just raise a red flag for the next time? They say, you know, if you get the question, don't want to answer it, turn around, try the border another day. Can that really work, or do agents, put up a red flag, take a name at the border, the next time you try to cross, you pop up on a computer as refusing to answer questions about cannabis? Isn't that a problem?
Well, it is, and that's what's going to happen. So if you refuse to answer questions at a port of entry, you will be denied entry for not cooperating, and you will be turned north back to Canada, but at least you won't be barred for life. And I tell Canadians, you can try a different day at a different port of entry, and chances are the officer, even though you will be sent inside for questioning, most officers don't zealously try to get you to admit to your past cannabis use or involvement. And so you have a better chance to try it on a different day at a different port of entry than basically putting yourself into this, lifetime bar, having to apply, the cost, the time. It's a much better solution, even though it is somewhat risky.
Warren, what are your thoughts on that?
I completely agree with Len on this. I mean, these officers, both on the Canadian side and the American side, have individual discretionary decision-making authority.
We should be clear, the Canadians now will be starting. On the Canadian side, if you come back from the U.S., it will now be a standard question at the Canadian border crossing. They will now ask if you're carrying cannabis or if you're...
I don't think so. I don't think...
The government's already said they'll be asking that question.
I don't think there's going to be a standard question always asked of most people. As Len says, this is a tool in the toolbox. If an officer, a U.S. officer we're talking about now, doesn't like the person for some other reason, they can pull that tool out of the toolbox. They can pop that question and see where that line of questioning goes. And if it goes into a direction of inadmissibility, they'll use it. But it's not going to be a standard question.
Len, let me ask you, what does a Canadian citizen do, and this is what you've been dealing with, if they've been banned for life from the U.S. for admitting to marijuana use? What can you do for them? You touched on it briefly about trying to work around this. What's involved in overturning a lifetime ban to the U.S.?
Well, you really can't overturn it, but what you can do is you can apply for a waiver, and the cost, just the filing fees alone, are $585 US, payable to the government. Usually if it's an admission to smoking marijuana, the applicant will get a 1 year, then maybe a 2, then a 3, then a 5-year waiver. This is just filing fees, not legal fees if someone hires an attorney like myself. I tell Canadians, if you have to file a waiver, you have to do it for the rest of your life. You basically become my client for life. And unfortunately, I've built up a huge clientele of repeat Canadian clients who've admitted to past cannabis use. A great example is Ross Rebliati. He has name recognition. He's just the tip of the iceberg of my typical Canadian client who has no criminal convictions, no past immigration violations, has merely admitted to using cannabis in the past.
So if it can happen to an Olympic athlete whose name is widely known, I suppose it can happen to all of us, Warren.
It can and it will.
Well, and
that's what's going to happen.
At some point to Prime Minister Trudeau.
Yeah, it could happen to the Prime Minister, certainly. If he's admitted to it in the past, if he admits it at a border crossing, yikes. What happens then?
It's all new to us, and we hope that water finds its level and that the animosity or the fear, the anxiety, could take a court challenge, It could take a court challenge by some courageous person,
in the U.S.
of Len's perhaps, who's been banned for life, wants to put the money, wants to take a stand, wants to go through the procedure of bringing an application, a judicial review of the decision, and let's see what a federal court in the United States says about this.
Do you think we're headed that way, Len Saunders? Final word to you.
I agree with Warren. I spoke to a couple of my colleagues in Washington State recently, and we're looking for one of those cases. Someone who admits at a U.S. port of entry to smoking cannabis legally in Canada, file the waiver, possibly get it denied, and then appeal it to the Board of Immigration Appeals in the U.S. So we're definitely considering that.
All right, we've got lots to watch for. Gentlemen, thank you both for your perspectives. Appreciate it.
Nice to be here.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, joining me now from San Francisco is Andrew Friedman. From 2014 to 2017, he served as the state of Colorado's Director of Marijuana Coordination, working to establish a framework for the regulation of recreational cannabis. He is now a co-founder and senior director with Friedman & Koski, a consulting firm that advises state and local governments. Mr. Friedman, first of all, thanks for taking time to speak with me today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Okay, let me talk about your experience and how Canadians might benefit from that. It's been legal in the state of Colorado now, recreational cannabis, for about 5 years. So you were at the forefront of efforts to regulate cannabis in the state. How successful would you say those efforts have been?
So, I'm not an advocate either way for or against legalization. And I would say, like any complex policy, there's been a mixed bag of things that in general, over the short term, if you look at everything that's happened in Colorado, I would say so far it's been a net positive, not by a ton, but by a bit. Some of the things we were fearing the most, like increase in youth use, hasn't happened, at least according to the data that we've seen.
Mm-hmm.
We are arresting fewer people for cannabis, and particularly fewer African Americans and Hispanics. We've seen tax revenue. It's not a game-changing amount of tax revenue, but it's a significant amount of tax revenue. There's some problems still. Driving while high is probably the one that I look at most. It's not conclusive, but there's some bad statistics there. But when you weigh it all out, I think right now it's still a worthwhile experiment.
Okay, I mean, so what's your advice to Canada then? What should Canada be watching for in the months ahead as legalization moves forward?
There should be some effort for group conversation. I think the thing that's going to happen that's going to be the most surprising is the fact that the policy issues are going to come up everywhere, from what do you do in schools to what do you do in hospitals, what do you do when somebody is a substance abuser and wants to substitute one substance for marijuana. All of it's pretty difficult questions, and the most important thing is that the dialogue stays open for the first couple of years to really be able to change these systems pretty dramatically in the face of any public health or public safety challenges that may come up.
Can I talk for a minute about the black market? Because that, when Colorado legalized recreational cannabis, it was one of the main objectives was to clamp down on the black market, as it is with legalization of recreational cannabis in this country. What's happening with the black market? Because in this country, we're hearing conflicting opinions. The governor there is saying that it's down to $50 million worth of the industry. We have a state senator there saying it could be 12 times that much. Has the crackdown on black market trafficking in cannabis been successful in Colorado?
So the reason you're hearing conflicting reports is essentially there are two black markets. If you're asking where do people in Colorado buy marijuana, the answer is they buy it licensed and large. A few people grow at home and they use kind of the systems they used before, but 95% of people are buying from the licensed market. Unfortunately, because we're kind of an island of legalization and everybody around us has prohibition still, there is still an incentive to grow at home and then to ship it to another state. And so we have inventory controls in our licensed businesses that stop that. We don't have those inventory controls for our home grows. So home grows is still a problem, and there still is significant amount of out-of-state diversion coming from our home grow system. If your question is how well has the license system replaced the black market inside Colorado, I think it's been a complete success.
Let me come back to something you talked about earlier, and that was some of the areas of concern still. And you mentioned, accidents involving drug-impaired drivers. We've also seen in Colorado, I think, we've seen surveys that say cannabis users have gotten behind the wheel in the last 30 days within 2 hours of using the drug. And I guess What's the lesson for that in Canada? Where should we be focusing? Because there's big concerns here about what's going to happen on the roads in this country. So how should we focus our efforts to try and see perhaps, and I know the jury's still out on how this is going to work eventually, but to see if we can get a little better result than what's happening these days in Colorado?
So I think the first thing that should happen, knowing that the technology is not quite where it is for alcohol, is a very clear campaign that's not condescending, but it's very clear that that driving while high is dangerous. There's a lot of places where I tend to agree with industry and advocates, and a lot of places where I disagree. One of the places where I disagree is a lot of their language around driving while high, about no proof that it's causing the problem it's causing. It's not conclusive, but it is pretty clear that people are dangerous on the roads, and post legalization think it's okay to drive while high. And so I think starting off with a very clear public education campaign that is dangerous, not just illegal, but actually dangerous, is really important.
All right. Thanks so much for giving us some perspective on your experience in Colorado and some things for Canadians to take as this process moves along in this country. Andrew Friedman, good to talk to you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And our Big Five Cannabis series continues Friday as we take a closer look at legalization and health concerns and what pot consumers, young and old, should know. Well, MPs in the House of Commons today started debate on the government's legislation to replace solitary confinement in federal penitentiaries. And the bill's already drawing a fire from all of the opposition parties. The government tabled the legislation after two separate court decisions found indefinite solitary confinement was unconstitutional and caused psychological harm. The courts gave the federal government until the end of this year to bring in changes. CPAC's Martin Stringer has been watching the debate and joins me now. And Martin, first of all, what would this legislation do?
Okay, well, Peter, this is called Bill C-83, and what C-83 would do is proposing to replace solitary confinement, which is actually called administrative segregation, with a new system in which the problem prisoners would be put into something called structured intervention units. Now, the government says under the new system, prisoners would have twice as much time outside of their cells, and they would be able to continue to access prison rehabilitation programs. Here's Ralph Goodale.
What we are proposing to put in place here is fundamentally different from administrative segregation. It is not the same approach. The courts have said if you're going to have administrative segregation, it's unconstitutional unless you provide for better oversight, unless you improve the conditions of confinement, unless you make a number of other structural changes. We've taken those messages to heart and said, rather than trying to repair administrative segregation, we're going to eliminate it entirely and replace it with a new approach.
So a new approach, Martin. What are the other key measures in the government's legislation?
Well, the bill also enshrines in the legislation the principle that Corrections Canada must take into account the background of Indigenous offenders in making decisions about them. It would also authorize body scanners to prevent contraband from being smuggled into prisons, and it would create a mental health advocate for prisoners. And that was a key issue in the death of 19-year-old Ashley Smith, who took her own life after having spent a total of 27 months of her 36 months in custody in segregation.
All right, so we talked about the government side, and what's the reaction from the opposition parties?
Well, basically what we're seeing now is that politically, the battle lines have been drawn after a first day of debate. The Conservatives don't even want the bill to go to committee. They're saying segregation is a vital disciplinary tool. Well, the NDP says that the new measures are just another version of the old solitary confinement. They think it won't even stand up in court. Let's hear from the opposition.
The stats show that segregation is a tool that can be used. It's very clear that it had been used incorrectly in a couple cases, and that's fine. They should address those individual ones. But our focus has to be on the protection of our CSC officers. They're under siege. They're having issues with mental health issues. Nothing in this bill addresses them.
When you have two courts ruling that the current use of solitary confinement is unconstitutional, And when you have the BC Supreme Court in particular that had a scathing decision that clearly lays out what the government needed to implement, and then is shamefully appealed afterwards, the question can be posed as to what the government is actually trying to do with C-83. And unfortunately, by all appearances, it seems that they want to bypass these court decisions and bypass what experts, civil society, and the UN have said insofar as the use of solitary confinement. And that, Madam Speaker, is reason enough to oppose C-83.
And Peter, when NDP critic Matthew Dubé quotes the opposition to the government's plan, he's also referring often to people like Senator Kim Pate. Now, she has spent most of her life as an advocate for prisoners' rights. She's constantly visiting inmates and prisons, as recently as just this last weekend. She says that the new legislation ignores two key concerns: abuse and appeal.
There aren't the same oversight measures that are in place right now for administrative segregation, which have already been found to be completely flawed and unreliable. And we just have to look at successive correctional investigator reports to see that outlined. And so to now be diminishing that oversight and leaving it within corrections, I think is extremely problematic. The reason many of us keep going back to judicial oversight is even when you have third parties come in, they're often contracted by corrections, and very, very few are willing to go to contradict what corrections is saying. And so we really need to have a step farther removed and allow judges to be able to look at this. And I think unfortunately, some lawyers and judges may be fooled by these provisions. I'm hoping that they will pay attention to the details in this and actually demand to have evidence that in fact things have actually changed.
And Peter, interestingly enough, Ralph Goodale did say today that he and the government are open to suggestions for more review mechanisms for prisoners who are put into these new structured intervention units. And also, it's really worth noting that the federal government is actually still appealing the BC and Ontario court rulings, which brought about the whole need for this legislation in the first place.
All right, Martin Stringer, thank you very much. A story we'll continue to track as this legislation makes its way through the process. Thank you.
You're welcome.
The federal government is taking measures to strengthen the laws against animal cruelty and bestiality. The action is being taken in the wake of a Supreme Court of Canada ruling in 2016 that found criminal code provisions on bestiality don't adequately define which sexual acts involving animals are prohibited. The proposed legislation bans any contact between people and animals for any sexual purpose. The bill also expands prohibitions against animal fighting. Here's Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould.
There have been many studies, recent studies, actually studies that came as a result of the Supreme Court of Canada decision that have made a definite link to activities with respect to bestiality and the presence of children in terms of child pornography and other despicable acts. There's a link from individuals and this doesn't necessarily reflect or specific to bestiality, but individuals that have been seen as being cruel to animals when they're younger grow up to have and engage in activities that are despicable or sexual violence in terms of kids or other individuals. So there's links that have been drawn scientifically.
Well, let's follow up on the animal protection measures being proposed by the Justice Minister today. Camille Labchuk is the Executive Director of Animal Justice. She's with me in our studio now. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Thanks for being here. The Minister of Justice is framing this legislation as the way she put it today was new protections for children and animals flowing from a Supreme Court ruling in 2016. Can we start there? What did that ruling say?
The ruling, unfortunately, and very surprisingly to most people, said that most forms of bestiality in this country are not illegal because our laws are so out of date that when they were contemplated, it required penetration of an animal to complete that offense.
Okay. And so that's 2016. We have, and I know you don't think it goes far, and we have some action from the government today. What has the delay meant from the time of the court decision, the court ruling, till the action taken by the government today?
Right. Well, it's been 2.5 years now since the Supreme Court made that decision, and there's been a lot of pushing of the government to get this happening. There have been 2 private members' bills in the interim. So Nathaniel Erskine Smith had a larger animal cruelty bill that included this, and Michelle Rempel from the Conservatives included a bill on bestiality specifically as well. So finally, we're seeing this. We're disappointed that it took this long to get to it because it is literally just a 14-word amendment to the criminal code, and it shouldn't have taken that long, but it's good that it's finally here.
Right, and essentially what it says is it now essentially prohibits, as I understand it, looking through it, prohibits any sexual contact between a human and an animal any contact for the purpose of sexual activity, and the government makes the point that closes the loophole in the law, does it?
It closes the loophole where some people were just not able to be prosecuted for non-penetrative conduct, but what it does is it opens up one more loophole, which is, so right now anyone convicted of an animal cruelty offense under the code, they can be subject to a prohibition order from a judge upon conviction so that they can never have an animal again for the rest of their life. But the bestiality provision that was introduced today doesn't include that measure, so the judges can't necessarily impose a ban on animal ownership. So we think that needs to happen as this bill works its way through Parliament.
Okay. Where else does it not meet the test as far as you're concerned?
Well, the bigger issue is that when the government voted against broader animal cruelty reforms in 2016, October 2016, so 2 years ago, it voted down animal cruelty legislation that would have modernized our severely outdated laws on a number of facets. Bestiality was one of those things, animal fighting was another one of those things. But today's legislation completely ignores all the rest of that, which is something they have promised to work on. So we're wondering, where is the action on that? Bill Blair stood up and spoke in the House of Commons about this legislation and said that they were taking it seriously, that they would consult, they would revise the overall laws, but so far we haven't seen that.
Okay, have you been part of the consultations? Minister said the government needed more time to have these extensive consultations. So did they come to you? Who have they spoken with that's causing the delay, I guess?
Well, to my knowledge, they have not started consultations on substantively revising the outdated animal cruelty sections of the criminal code. So we haven't been consulted, colleagues in other groups have not been consulted. We don't think it's something that they've undertaken yet, and we think it really needs to happen. If you poll Canadians, over 90% support stronger animal cruelty laws, and you can't get 90% of Canadians to agree on too much, but that's one thing they do agree on, so it needs to happen.
Well, why do you think there's a delay? If there's this body of consensus, what's taking so much time?
There's no real good reason to explain why there has been a delay. It's something that enjoys very broad support among the public. I know that tens of thousands of emails and phone calls have been made to the minister's office, to members of parliament asking for change. What we are concerned about is the influence of industries like farming, like hunting, like fishing. Every time animal cruelty legislation comes up, they fearmonger and say that it will shut down their industries, which of course is not accurate. The only thing that anyone is asking for is common sense reforms to make it easier to prosecute sadistic animal cruelty, and that's something everyone can agree on.
Right. So does that mean that you're not looking to target farming practices today in Canada unless there's some sadistic element to them?
Well, the criminal code is used to punish sadistic conduct. When you look at the overall regulation of farming practices, that's a different area, but also one that does need attention. A lot of people are very surprised to learn that there is no regulations pertaining to the treatment of animals on farms up until the day they're transported for slaughter. So their entire lives from when they're born until they're transported are just unregulated. So that needs to change too, but... And
none of that is covered in this bill?
No, that's far beyond the scope of what's covered today.
All right, lots to watch for. Thanks for coming to talk with us today. Camille Lapchuk from Animal Justice. Good
Thanks for having me.
Well, this coming week, Canadian Armed Forces are taking part in something called Trident Juncture. It's the largest in a series of long-planned NATO exercises. It takes place in Norway and the North Atlantic and Baltic Sea. It involves 31 NATO and other partner countries and some 45,000 personnel. Canada is sending a contingent of 2,000. That also includes Canadian frigates and CF-18s. These military exercises may be long-planned and important for NATO training and preparedness, but they will also send a clear message to Moscow. Let's bring in Alison Smith, the host of Perspective here on CPAC this Sunday. Alison, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
What's this all about? What's the message?
Well, the message is obviously one of deterrence, and that's why we've got Canadian soldiers in Latvia on the border with Russia. But also, I think they're just flexing their muscle toward Vladimir Putin and Russia and saying, you know, pay attention here. We're going to meet force with force. But I think really we're focusing on the threat that Russia may pose to the West, particularly. But it's not just the military threat. That's a piece of it. It's really what we've been, you know, talking about so much with the United States and interference in the election. But with election coming up in Canada and security agencies here in Canada saying that there was foreign interference in the 2015 election, we wanted to kind of stand back a little bit and look at Russia and what's at play, not only within the country, but the threat that it poses, obviously, beyond its borders. One of the key people we talked to is a man called Tom Nichols. He's a professor at the U.S. Naval War College and also at the Harvard Extension School. He's a real expert on Russia, as well as an author. And I will tell you, a 5-time Jeopardy winner, if that doesn't make you a smart guy to listen to. Anyway.
Now you've got everyone's attention. Yeah.
Exactly. So listen to a little bit about what Tom Nichols says about Vladimir Putin himself.
If you want to understand Putin, you have to understand that he's not a communist, he's not a Russian nationalist in that sense. He came up in the Soviet system. What he really misses is the days when the Soviet Union was a superpower. And that he misses the days of being a citizen of a state that is globally respected and powerful and a peer to the United States. The way I always put it is, if you really want to know what Vladimir Putin wants, he wants 1975 back. He wants the Soviet Union to be kind of astride the globe, the Americans, you know, defeated in Vietnam, the American economy in shambles, and you know, the American political system, of course, was a hot mess in 1975 after Watergate. I think he looks back to those days and says, if I can create that kind of chaos again, that's a good day for me as a Russian leader.
That said, Nichols and others would say it's a mistake to sort of think about this as a return to the Cold War. There's obviously different geopolitical concerns at play here. So we talked to a number of people. Actually, we spoke to an academic and analyst in Moscow himself, talked about Putin's own popularity, and also to an analyst and an activist around the whole disinformation and sort of that kind of interference, which is probably the biggest concern that we have here in Canada.
Yeah,
too.
we have an election coming up in a year from now in this country. How do you check that Russian interference?
You know, it's interesting. Basically, you know, when you read about it and talk to the experts about it, it's about sort of an informed electorate, about understanding where you're getting your news from and making sure that you're not just getting your news from social media. Certainly, there is a government responsibility in terms of, you know, speaking to social media platforms, but as pointed out, you can't censor, you know, sort of the incoming information. But as consumers and as citizens, we've got to figure out how to be smart about it.
All right, well, lots to follow, and make sure to join Alison Smith for Perspective this Sunday on CPAC, and you see the times here on your screen. Make sure to tune in. Thanks, Alison.
Thank you.
The Conservatives kept up their questioning today for the government in Parliament over the prosecution of the former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff, Vice Admiral Mark Norman. He's accused of leaking information about the government's deliberations related to the contract to lease a naval supply ship. Norman's legal team claims federal cabinet minister Scott Bryson from Nova Scotia worked to scuttle a proposal from a Quebec shipyard. The opposition's been pressuring the government to release confidential documents to the Norman defence team to ensure he gets a fair trial.
Vice Admiral Mark Norman to get a fair trial, his defence team has requested and has the rights to evidence relevant to his case. The evidence includes recordings of cabinet meetings where the shipbuilding contract was discussed. We know that cabinet meetings are recorded, and we know that the Prime Minister has the full legal authority to release those recordings. Will he do so, and if not, what is he hiding?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member knows as a long-standing member of this House, the government does not comment or speculate on matters that are related to ongoing criminal trials. That is the long-standing convention of this House, Mr. Speaker, and it's important that the judicial system be free to conduct itself completely in an independent fashion. That's important for the prosecution, that is important for the defense, and we will not comment on ongoing processes.
Well, let's bring in our panel of our weekly panel of political commentators. Joining me this week are Liberal commentator Greg McEachern, Conservative commentator Tim Powers, and NDP commentator Robin McLaughlin. Good to see you, gentlemen. Thanks for being here. Let's start our conversation with these continuing questions about the case of Vice Admiral Mark Norman. Just to set the scene again, we saw some more exchanges in the House of Commons today about really the question to me is, what rights does Vice Admiral Norman have to cabinet confidences or his legal team as they try to defend him against this breach of trust charge that he's facing, this court case that he's facing? Greg, let me start with you. The government is saying, there's a court process, but there's two questions here, I think. What can you say during a court process? But the questions the opposition is putting are really about the documents, preserving documents, and are you prepared to serve up the documents the defense team says they need as part of a fair trial? Where's this going, do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV. So in terms of the legal aspects, I really can't speak to that. What I do notice, the lines that the government uses would be no different than any other government if they're in the same situation. I think the challenge for the Liberals is answering why are they in this situation. And I think to kind of pull the politics out of this, we have to recall that I believe the charge is breach of trust by a public official. The Chief of Defense Staff relieved him of his job. Those are serious things, and I think it would do well for everyone to remember that. And I think the other thing is the government's stuck in a place where they really can't say much until it goes before the court. I think if the government talks about the independence of the process, but we're going to see whether or not a judge agrees. Yeah. And I think that's probably going to be where this will be answered. It's not going to be answered on the floor of the House during question period.
Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, I feel for Mark Norman, and what public coverage is available seems to suggest he might have been railroaded into this circumstance. The opposition, as you say, is perhaps somewhat legitimately interested in helping him, but they're also more likely to be interested in trying to get at Minister Bryson and point the spotlight at another Liberal minister that finds himself in a difficult set of circumstances. The politics of that, as we all know, are about getting at the Liberals' greatest vulnerability, the sense that if the Liberals are self-interested and they're behaving in that manner, that's not good for you, and that's something they're looking to exploit.
And I think, and the whole notion that the Liberals came into power promising a new era of transparency and openness. But Robin, are there two things at play here? So the one thing is, okay, are you prepared to release documents that maybe make some part of the case for Mark Norman, but at the same time, the documents might be able to prove, or the defense alleges that Scott Bryson played a role in trying to scuttle this deal for the naval supply ship, but doesn't that still leave the question? But even if that were the case, he's still accused of leaking documents. I mean, aren't those two said? Not what's in the documents, but you leak documents. And as an employee of the government, you're not allowed to do that.
Yeah, no, Greg's entirely right that these are very serious accusations, and I mean a lot of important principles at play. But those principles of both of your role as a senior civil servant, but also principles of justice. And I'm not a lawyer either, but
to be clear, nobody here's a lawyer.
Nobody here's a lawyer, which is why we should really definitely delve into this. But no, but I think on face value, if any party that can selectively disclose documents can really make a case look skewed one way or the other. So the government does in this case, for right or wrong, it's definitely cabinet confidentiality is a key principle. But when it can selectively disclose documents to the courts, as Admiral Norman's lawyer is suggesting, it can certainly paint a certain picture that it would like to paint. But the government also has to be careful about not having it both ways. The Prime Minister, I think, got himself in a little bit of trouble with comments he made when we were talking about this back in the spring, where he was really kind of implying that this will all play itself out when it goes to court, and oh yeah, it's going to go to court. And then now saying, well, you can't discuss anything that's before the court. So if you want to hide behind that, and most governments do hide behind that, can't discuss what's before the courts, you got to be consistent on it. And I think the opposition has rightly pointed out that they've been inconsistent there.
So if you know, how significant, or does it matter that, I mean, at the end of the day, for a lot of people who aren't maybe, you know, absorbed in the niceties of cabinet confidences and breach of trust by a public servant, what if there's a connection between the breach of trust and basically I'm trying to get the notion of what if he was doing the right thing? What if he actually can show that there was a cabinet was heading one way and cabinet went in a different direction because of what some would argue in brackets, you know, political interference by another minister. At the end of the day, if he stood up for what he thought was right, does that count? But how can he prove it?
Well, yeah, it's hypothetical. How can he prove it? I think there's a lot.
Well, you might be able to prove it by getting the documents.
But there's a little bit here of the other part of the politics is that there's one plan from a former Conservative minister, Peter MacKay, and you've got Scott Bryson, not exactly two people that, you know, I would say would be very close. You see a lot of Conservatives in terms of donations to Norman's Defence Fund. There's a lot of, I think Jason Kenney was one of the donors. So there does feel a little bit of the politics here. And again, I think this is why it does really need, as Robin said, a lot of governments do use this line, but they really do need the clarity of court to kind of simplify
but the project came up through the bureaucracy, and then it was supported by other members of cabinet, right?
Yeah, and also many. It's not just Peter MacKay and Scott Bryson. Many, and that interesting relationship. There's been many hands that touch that file. The element I think that I'm reading out of this, again, with the publicly available information, is there may have been others, and I think Norma's defense team is suggesting this, within the bureaucracy who had a different agenda, and to your point, Norman was standing up to that. Obviously, that's a line of defense they're advancing, but again, that would probably require the release of a broader cachet of evidence and information for the Norman team to make that. But all three of us in our different businesses have dealt with at different times military procurement, and all three of us, though not experts in it, would say, though, it would be hardly surprising to hear that within the Department of National Defense there were unelected officials and or elected officials who had very diametrically opposed agendas.
And I guess I'm wondering if that's where the rubber hits the road for a lot of Canadians who, like I say, aren't down in the weeds with the process, but they will understand a message that says, can he get a fair trial if you don't turn over the documents?
You can't.
I think
you cannot have a fair trial from the principles of justice if you cannot see the access to the evidence that the other side has. That's a key principle of justice. Now, the problem is it's running up against other principles in government, which are things like cabinet confidence
and national security.
And I could not. I'm not the person who can tell you which one needs to win the day. But as Tim was, I think, hinting at there, procurement, especially military procurement, every government tries to keep politics out of it, or at least says they try to keep politics out of it, and it almost often always does seem to get some element of politics. And whenever you're looking at Quebec procurement opportunities versus rest of Canada procurement opportunities, then you do get even more politics. We can look at the creation of the Bloc Québécois, and Prime Minister Mulroney ran into the problems there.
Okay, let's change subjects here, and let's talk about the rollout of, speaking of, we're still with procurement, I guess. Speaking of the rollout of legal cannabis, here's what we know after 24 hours, I think, if I can melt it down into this. Demand's been so high that supplies become an issue. Prices are too high for some buyers in different parts of Canada. Police are handing out tickets already for drivers caught with cannabis in the car. The government's offering pardons for past convictions, but not complete expungement of records, and the U.S. is saying pardons won't make a difference at the border. If I sort of got basically where we're at, so I want to know from you, Greg, what do you think of it 24 hours into what some are calling this experiment with legal cannabis?
The hunt for Green October. I would like to see a moratorium.
How long have you been saving that?
No, it's only been about a day old. But I'd like to see a moratorium on the pot jokes and headlines. It's kind of interesting. In the bubble here in Ottawa, there's a lot of very, we're very tired of the coverage, but it is a very significant achievement. I think it's going to be, there's some things that we haven't looked at, and I think the unintended consequences, I mean, In the green room, we were talking about the story about the Girl Guide.
And we don't call it the green room for that reason.
Yeah,
but,
yeah, fair. One more.
One more joke.
But I think there's other things too that we're going to be seeing that have yet to happen. I think there's probably going to be pot tourism that Canada will start to take advantage of. I just looked at Colorado. I think it's a population of about 5 million, and I think in 2016, 2017, they were looking at about 100 million in terms of taxes and benefits. So that's the next thing that I'm going to watch for is how are the provinces going to handle this. You've seen some pushback in Ontario already. We seemed in Ontario to have less access than we do in some other provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador.
Okay, Tim, observations?
Yeah, my mom bought it all. Sorry, Mom.
Observations after day one.
I tell you what was staggering yesterday. I was saying this to Greg in that so-called green room. Never smelt any weed yesterday. I was in Uruguay for one day, the other country that has legalized pot. Smelt it everywhere. Didn't smell any weed yesterday, though.
It did also snow in Ottawa yesterday. So
well, maybe my senses were deprived. The other thing that I find interesting on the politics of this is Norman and that story has led question period. The Conservatives are trying, they're offering some compulsory questions and pushing, but the data's been pretty damn clear. Even Conservatives in significant numbers have recognized the ship has sailed on all of this. That to me has been enjoyable to watch, that finally Conservatives are accepting this.
Oh, Conservatives like to smoke pot too. I think that's what that tells you. Look, we did some polling on this, and in advance of legalization, Canadians are kind of like, meh. Like it's not that big a deal.
Yeah, we've had David Coletto on the program saying, even those who weren't crazy about having it are accepting that it's here.
And the truth is, so it became legal, and in spite of the fact that it did snow in Ottawa, the sky did not fall, and all is continuing on as it should. I think Greg's right to point out that there are some access issues, and I think the government, as the regulator of suppliers and distributors, is going to have a challenge here, because if there is not enough of a supply in the system, you cannot stop the black market. So in Ontario, I would guess that yesterday, as many purchases of marijuana may have gone through the black market as went through the legal-only online market. But I'd like to pick up on the expungement versus pardon issue, because this is one that Liberals have been under fire from the left, from the NDP, and from activists for quite some time, because they were only dealing with legalization and not dealing with the issue of records. The problem with a pardon, you hit on it, Peter, it is a suspension of your record. It still shows up when you get stopped by the police, it still shows up at the border, and the U.S. won't care about it. So they should pick up NDP MP Murray Rankin's bill, which calls for complete expungement. I'm sure he'd be very delighted if the government took that as their own.
Lots still to watch for as the country gets used to this new reality. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all for another edition of Primetime Politics here on CPAC. We are the Cable Public Affairs Channel. I'm Peter Van Dusen. Thanks for watching.